This is the Learn Jazz Standards Podcast, episode 110.
Welcome to the LJS Podcast, where you get weekly jazz tips, interviews, stories, and advice for becoming a better jazz musician. And now your host. He's a jazz musician, author, and entrepreneur, Brent Vaartstra.
All right, what's up, everybody? My name is Brent. I am the jazz musician behind the website LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, and videos all geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. So excited to be here, and I have a very special guest on the show today that I know you're going to love. It's Nick Mainella from the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. This is an excellent podcast where Nick every single week is laying down some jazz tips and advice for everybody. So be sure to check out the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. And I'm excited to have him on because he's going to talk all about the blues today and how you can crush it on the blues. Now, the blues, we have never honed in on the blues before on the show, and so I'm stoked about this because the blues is really important in jazz. It really is the foundation of jazz and how it all started, and it's still a big part of the music today. So we need to understand the blues, how to play the blues, how to improvise over it. So I'm really excited to dive into that today. So before we get into the interview with Nick, I just want to say, if this is your very first time listening to the show, I want you to know you're in the right place. If you are a beginner trying to get into jazz, maybe you're just trying to see what's out there, understand what it is, or whether you're an intermediate player or even an advanced player, there's something here for everybody. And I come out with a show every single week to serve you, to help you become a better musician. So, subscribe to iTunes, subscribe to your favorite podcast listening service if you haven't done already. Don't ever miss a show that's coming out. And I'm going to make a pledge to you today. If you come and you're listening every single week, and as long as you're here, I'm going to be here coming out with free jazz lessons, tips, advice every single week to serve you more, okay? So subscribe on iTunes and make sure you're connected. All right, so I'm going to get Nick Mainella on for this interview, and just to let you know, he has a really cool blues course that he's going to talk about at the end of the show, so stick around for that. All right, without further ado, here is Nick Mainella from the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. All right, welcoming on the show today is Nick Mainella. He is a saxophonist, and he is the host of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. Nick, thanks for being here today.
Oh, man, thank you so much for having me, Brent. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Well, I just love your podcast, and I've been a fan. I have a feeling that some other people who listen to my podcast listen to yours too, which is super fun and super cool. And so I'm glad that, I'm just excited to have you on today and talk. But for those who maybe don't know you, could you give like the 1 minute Nick Mainella, what do you actually do?
Yeah, so basically I'm a saxophonist. I live just north of Boston in the Boston area. I teach a lot of lessons, play a lot of music, and just recently over the past couple of years have been really getting into podcasting. So I run actually two podcasts, the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast I've had going for quite a while now. And then brand new on the podcast scene is a saxophone podcast called Everything Saxophone that I've just started with my colleague Donna Schwartz. And that one's a little bit more centered around interviewing great saxophonists and talking about the instrument. But yeah, the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson is kind of my passion. I've been doing it for a long time. And what we do on that show is just basically pick a topic and we do around a 10-minute lesson on it. Sometimes it spills over because, as you know, some of these topics are pretty deep. And it's just been great. I've been able to connect with people all over the world and hopefully spread some knowledge to people that maybe don't have the traditional means of, being near a large city or being able to study with somebody. So that's kind of what I do and what I'm all about.
That's awesome. Yeah, and definitely, if you haven't listened to the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast, definitely go check it out. It's such a great show. And I saw that you're approaching episode 100. Is that right?
Yeah, actually.
Dude.
So next week will be episode 100. So I'm pretty excited about it.
Oh, man. Congratulations.
Thank you.
At the time we're recording this, Episode 100 might be out, and we actually passed. When was it? Was it in February or? I forgot. We passed the episode 100 mark recently, which was super fun.
That's
2 years
awesome.
of the podcast. So congratulations, man. That's so great. And
you as well, man.
Oh, thanks. I just appreciate that you're out there serving people and spreading the jazz education love. And I think we both know that music is a great thing. Jazz is a great music, and so it's great just to have someone who does this as well. So that's so cool. So let's dig a little deeper. Let's dig a little bit deeper. How did you get started with music? Like, what got you so amped up about it?
Yeah, it's I guess kind of a normal story of being a kid, and my dad was a saxophone player. Went to Berkeley in the 1970s, and then he's been a public school educator for the past about 35 years. So just growing up around a lot of music, hearing my dad play the saxophone, being able to dig through his record collection from a very, very young age was amazing, and just kind of having the sound of some pretty advanced music. Again, from a young age, I think kind of pushed me towards it. So then when it came time to choose an instrument in school, of course, I wanted to be like my dad, so I chose saxophone. And I think just having all that music kind of floating around in my head, I took to it pretty quickly. And it wasn't easy because, of course, playing any instrument is not easy, especially playing jazz. But I feel like I had a leg up just from having all that music in my ears. And then just continued to get more serious about it through middle school, high school. Ended up going to the University of New Hampshire for my undergrad in saxophone performance, and then headed out to Western Michigan University after that to get a master's in jazz performance. And then after that, just kind of been living the life of a musician, trying to kind of cobble together a living, as I'm sure you know, all the things that go along with that. But have a large studio of private students, and just trying to get better at the instrument every single day, and juggle all the things that are going on. But it really is, all the difficulties that go along with a life in music that are really kind of worth it at the end of the day. When you kind of look back on what you did that day and really appreciate it. So yeah, just kind of, started with the saxophone and never really looked back. And it's been great. I have no complaints.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are a lot of struggles that go along with being a professional musician, but there are so many rewards as well. And even if you're listening, and most of you listening are not professional musicians, but you love the music and you're passionate about it, and it brings some kind of fulfillment or happiness in your life. Well, that's the same thing that we feel too. You just were a little bit more intelligent with your career choice, so just feel good about that. Oh, that's so great. So your father was really influential then in getting you into the music, and that's really cool. What was there ever, because not everybody just kind of jumps into jazz, like, oh, jazz is the music, like, because it is kind of a music that you have to appreciate, right? You have to enjoy the artistry of it. Was there any big aha moments for you where you're like, oh man, I really love jazz and I really want to pursue at least this music primarily, because we all pursue other kinds of musics too, but was there a moment like that?
I think so. When I was I had the good fortune of going to a school with a very good music program, and I definitely credit that to a lot of my love for music and ultimately success in a career in music. So, when I was in middle school and early high school, I played in the jazz band. The teacher would give us, the blues scales and some really basic, jazz improvisation language to use. But then when I was towards the end of my freshman year of high school, we got a student teacher who came in and worked with the ensembles, and he is still to this day one of the best jazz tenor saxophone players I've ever heard. His name is Bill Jones. He's a Boston area musician, and he kind of hipped me to the fact that this music is endless. Like it's bottomless. You could work on this for your entire life and not get to the, nexus of playing jazz. So that was like the turning point for me, was just seeing somebody as serious as him. And then realizing how much work he was doing on the horn every day, and how much I like to hear him play, and how much I just like to hang out with him. Like the first time I think you get to hang out with a real live jazz musician who's really doing it, and is that serious about it, it can really change your life. And he introduced me to like all of my favorite players these days. So I think he was the first guy that like hipped me to Coltrane and Joe Henderson, and he was going to New England Conservatory at the time. So it was kind of funny actually, because he would give me some stuff in our lessons that was like so far over my head. Like I look back on it and some of it is still over my head to this day. And I think most people would consider that like, well, what the heck was he doing? But to me, it really, like I said earlier, it was like, oh my gosh, like this stuff is crazy. If I can get to even scratch the surface of some of the stuff that he's giving me, this is going to be an awesome thing. So that really ignited my passion. I fully credit him to kind of opening my eyes to the bigger world of jazz than I think would have happened if he didn't come to school and turn us on to all this kind of stuff. So big shout out to Bill Jones. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, Bill. So yeah, that's so funny you say that, because my big jazz influencer, the guy that really got me hooked, like the first tune he gave me to play was Inner Urge by Joe Henderson.
Wow,
and
the first one.
Well, yeah. And I asked him years, like, why did you, like, I guess he just thought that I would be into that because I was coming from prog rock, and I don't actually think he was thinking about it really. But I'll tell you something, like, that was an insane song, right? But I guess just the dedication that I had to have just to like try to at all improvise over that without having any knowledge of anything really helped me to persevere with just about everything else in jazz.
Right.
And by the way, like if you're OCD, this is a nightmare of a music, right? Because there is, like you were saying, there's it's endless. It just keeps going. So. Yeah.
And I'll never forget, I always kind of tell this story, but at the University of New Hampshire, I had the good fortune to meet and study a little bit with James Moody.
Oh my goodness.
And I mean, he was like about to turn 80 when he came out there, and we hung out. And man, I'll never forget, he said, come by my hotel room tomorrow morning at like 9 a.m. and we'll hang out and go over some stuff. So I showed up at the hotel room, and as I'm walking down the hall, I can hear him playing. And I knock on the door, he lets me in, and he's got like music just out all over the bed. He's got like several saxophone mouthpieces out. Like it's clear that he had been practicing for hours already that morning. And I mean, you look at a guy like that, he's played with everybody. He's a legend. He knows more about jazz than I probably ever will. And he's still working his butt off, like at the age of 80, trying to get better. So that really drove it home to me too. Like, okay, wow, it really is never ending. And while I think that can actually defeat a lot of people, I think if you make the mental decision to let it inspire you, things are going to go a lot better.
100%. And that it really is a mental decision, because that can break people down, or it can just be a lifetime of endless discovery and fun. So great point you make there. And that's cool that you got to study a bit with James Moody. So I'm excited to have you on to talk a little bit about the blues today, which is actually something on this show that we've never really just honed in on and really just unpacked. But at the end of the day, the blues is so important when it comes to jazz music, and understanding, knowing the blues, getting deep inside of it, can make a huge impact. So I thought it'd be great to start by asking you, why is the blues so important in jazz?
Yeah, for several reasons. I think the first is that if you trace the lineage of this music back to its roots, the blues is present in all forms. So if you think about, the culture that brought about this music, it came originally from field songs, and then that kind of morphed into the blues. And the blues kind of morphed into something a little bit more swinging that was eventually called jazz. But it's been ever present throughout. So I think the fact that we still play the blues, like I would imagine that almost any gig that you go to, you're going to hear at least one blues being played. It's just kind of something that we do as jazz musicians. And not only is it a super fun form to play over, it's a great place to get started because it's a relatively simple form. Like it's not inner urge, you know what I mean? It's something that's a little bit easier to and less intimidating to get into. And it also contains a lot of the devices that are going to be used in more complicated tunes, but it presents itself in a more accessible way. And also the really nice thing about the blues is that you can play it in a lot of different ways. So you could play it in a very, very simple form at a slow tempo, or you can start adding a lot of changes to it and actually making it a lot more difficult. You could do a lot of substitutions over the blues. So it's just kind of a nice base of operations for a lot of the music that you're going to start studying after the blues. So I'm a firm believer. In fact, most of my students, the first thing we work on is the blues. And I know that's the case in a lot of schools. Like the first thing you ever improvise over is the blues because it's something where a teacher can give you just one scale and say, go. And that's really nice with younger kids, but you can also get really, really deep with the blues, which is why I really appreciate it because it has that dichotomy.
And I think the blues, too, is really accessible, right? Because,
Yeah.
I mean, even further than just it being a big deal in jazz, if you think about it, most popular music has roots in the blues. Like
Right.
rock has, I mean, everything has evolved, right? But
Exactly.
like it all has roots there. This African-American music that started, that it's just branched out into all these different styles that have just morphed and, you know, and taken influence from multiple different places. But
Yeah.
that's also, even outside of jazz, it's super important. Well, you mentioned a second ago that there's a lot of different ways you can play the blues and styles and ways. And so before our interview here, I was asking the Learn Jazz Standards community Facebook group if they had any questions for you. And so here's a great one from Lewis. And he says, what is the difference between a major and a minor blues? Maybe we can start talking about that because those are two different styles right there.
For sure. So, you know, obviously the main difference, and I'm sure most of the people know this out there, but, you know, major and minor are two very different things, right? So it's going to give you a completely different sound, whether you're playing chords that have a major third or whether you're playing chords that have a minor chord. So on surface level, that's obviously the main difference, but that's also said in the name, the major blues, the minor blues. Another difference would be is that the minor blues is actually a little bit less complicated, in my opinion. So typically when we're playing a major blues, like if we take the first four measures, for example, most jazz musicians are going to play the one chord in the first measure, then they're going to play the four chord in the second measure, and then go back to the one chord for the remainder of that first four bars. In the minor blues, we actually just hang out on the one chord for the first four bars. So that's a huge difference. And that's where the minor blues is actually maybe a little bit more accessible. But I tend to start everybody on the major blues, but that's neither here nor there. Another big difference would be the turnaround. Traditionally, in a major blues, we have a 2-5-1 turnaround, which is probably the most common chord progression in jazz. Right. In minor blues, it's a little different. Typically, what we see is a flat 6-5 turnaround in the minor blues. But there are, you know, hundreds of minor blueses out there, and they all do different things. But I'm thinking of a simple minor blues like maybe Mr. PC by John Coltrane. You know, it's the one chord for 4 bars. And then we jump to the 4 chord in bar 5, back to the 1 chord in bar 7, like a traditional blues. And then he does that flat 6-5 turnaround.
Yeah.
So those would be the main differences that pop into my mind when I think about the difference between major and minor blues.
And by the way, that 5/6, the flat 6, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that really that chromatic bass that goes from the, like if we're in the key of C, it's A flat to G.
Exactly.
G is the 5 chord, and then C minor 7 or C minor 6, whatever, is the 1 chord. Is that a substitute? Like, where does that come from? Is that a substitute for the 2 chord, or what is that?
Yeah, it is definitely. Well, in my mind, I feel like it's a substitute for the 2 chord. Just doing that chromatic motion going down to the 5 chord, it just provides for a totally different sound. So if you listen to a lot of the, greats play over a minor blues as opposed to a major blues, what you'll hear over the turnaround is a lot of sequencing, right? So sequencing meaning play something in one key and then you play it in another key. Right. Yeah. So I tend to hear a lot more of that when I listen to the minor blues. And I think that's actually a really fantastic way to maybe work on the turnaround over a minor blues, is pick something to play over that flat 6 dominant chord and then play the exact same thing over the 5 chord and then resolve that in some way. Right. So, for example, I've got my horn right next to me, so I could actually.
Nice.
Let's play something. So if we're in the key of, I tend to find that the most common key of minor blues is concert C minor. So then you're looking at, an A flat 7 chord going down to a G7 chord. So you could play something as simple as maybe arpeggiating both chords. Mm-hmm. So, in bar 9, we'll play. Right. So I'm just going down 5, 3, 1, 7. On that flat 6 chord, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing over the 5 chord. So, and there's endless possibilities of stuff that you can do with that, but that's maybe a good way to get started.
But you could hear the great thing is you could hear those changes when you played it.
Right.
Oh, the power of chord tones. It's amazing.
Exactly. It is. It's truly awesome.
Now, one more question on this, just for those who are like major, minor blues. Now, it can be confusing for people when we call it the major blues, because a lot of people think, well, wouldn't the 1 chord be a major chord? But it's not, right? It's a dominant 7th chord. Like, any insights on why that is, where that comes from?
Well, let me start by saying, like, I still consider a dominant chord a major chord. Okay. It just doesn't have a major 7, right? Because what defines major is the 3rd, right?
Right.
So I think it's okay to call it the major blues, but yeah, there is some clarification needed, right? We're not dealing with major 7 chords. We're dealing with dominant 7th chords, but we still do have that major 3rd, and I think that's the real point of contention there. And I don't know. I mean, so I guess the reason why a dominant 7th chord is used in the blues is because it has a little bit more tension to it. And I mean, if you think about the genre of the blues, it's not happy music, right? It's called the blues for a reason. I mean, a blues can be really joyful and fun to listen to, but just that little bit of added tension with the flatted 7th, right? It really. I don't think they would have called it the blues if we were using all major 7 chords.
Dude, I totally put you on the spot there, man, because like I didn't know, so I was asking.
Yeah,
you.
Right.
That was more for me. I was like, nah, just the blues, man. You just play a dominant 7th chord. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thanks for bearing with it. That was an impossible question to answer. But yeah, so anyways, that's a good thing to understand. Now, since we're on the topic of chord changes, another question from somebody in the Facebook community group, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to butcher your name, Zung. Americans cannot pronounce anything else other than American names, so please accept my apologies. His question is, how do you know which version of the chord changes to play since there's so many variations? Just by listening to each other, talking in advance, so that's actually a great question, because there are different variations on the blues. There's actually a lot of different variations on the blues. Maybe could you talk about, like, what would you consider like a most basic like core, like blues, like right at the core, like what are like the chord changes that you would consider? Yeah,
so at its most basic form, you have basically 4 chords. You have the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 2 chord, and the 5 chord. And those are going to be your basic building blocks for every single thing that comes after it. And the person who asked that question is totally right. And this might seem daunting to somebody who's not a super experienced jazz musician. Is like, okay, well, we're playing, and how do we know what each other are going to do? And how do we connect on that? And the answer really is that, I mean, when you think about jazz, you have to listen to the other people that are playing, right? I mean, it's a music of listening and reacting. So let's say that you're playing a group and with a group, and everybody in the group is sort of amateur, right? So you're just getting started. You're playing with your friends. This is maybe your first foray into jazz music. I don't think you're going to have much trouble. You could go with the most basic form of the blues and just really work on mastering that first. So before you start adding a whole bunch of changes, make sure that you can really sound great just on the basic changes. And let me do a little bit of an overview of what I would consider basic changes. So we already kind of talked about the first 4 bars. We've got the 1 chord, and then in the second bar, we go to the 4 chord, back to the 1 chord. And that's your first 4 measures. Second 4 measures, pretty simple. Go to the 4 chord for bars 5 and 6. Go back to the 1 chord for bars 7 and 8. And then the last 4 bars are pretty simple as well. Usually what I do, bar 9, a 2 chord, bar 10, a 5 chord, and then back to the 1 chord in bar 11. And then usually what I'll do is I'll use a 5 chord in the last measure of the blues to sort of get me back into the top, right? And I think that that's the blues at its kind of most basic form. Now, of course, there are actually more basic ways to play it, but I think if you want to play, quote unquote, the jazz blues, I think that that's going to be your most basic form.
Right.
And then as far as adding other chords, like I said, wait until you can totally kill it just using that basic form before you look into, other like secondary dominant things, like putting the 6 chord in bar 8, or playing a turnaround in the last 2 bars, or something that's really going to, I always say, burn a lot of brain cells, right? Make sure that you're really getting it done with the most basic form. And then let's say that you are still at kind of a basic level, but you're playing with a rhythm section that's just like fantastic, professional musicians, amazing. You don't need to worry at all about what they're going to do, because if you're playing with an amazing rhythm section, they're going to be listening to what you're doing, right? Totally. Now, on the flip side, if you're a rhythm section player, one of the things that you should really work on is like really honing in on the soloist and trying to really develop your ears to react to what the soloist is doing. That's what all the best rhythm sections do. And at first, that's going to be really, really difficult. But I promise you that a soloist is not going to get super mad at you if they're like, "Oh man, I was trying to play a tritone substitution and you didn't get it." Like that's not going to happen.
No.
But if you hear something, let's say that you're a pianist and you're playing with a horn player, and you could hear that the horn player really likes to do something in bar 10 every time, start to just think about and decipher maybe what that sound is. So you could think, well, is it dissonant? Okay, well, that leads me to maybe a certain set of sounds that it could be. Are they playing in just a different key entirely? Okay, well, that might be a little bit harder to figure out, but at least you've sort of narrowed it down to some of the devices that the soloist is using. But I guess at its core is you just have to listen. You have to listen and react to what's going on around you. And that can be one of the most intimidating things about jazz, but it can also be one of the most rewarding things about jazz.
Absolutely. Listening is everything, because it is a very social music. Like, all music is social, but I mean, jazz is really social. And I'll add a little bit more just to get to also add to the heart of that question there is, if you want to know which chord changes you should play. It's about listening, but you have to also be educated too. You have to understand, what are those basic changes. And I think also a great way to do that is just to go out and learn a bunch of different blues heads or different blues chord changes. Like,
for sure,
go out and learn of just a basic rock and roll blues that's like 1, 4, 5. Then go out and check out a bunch of different jazz blueses. Like, check out Sandu, check out Tenor Madness, check out Freddie Freeloader, which it actually goes to has a little backdoor dominant at the end of the form that leads back into the one chord. So if you hip yourself to all these different chord changes and listen to all this stuff, then it's not a matter of which are the right changes, which are the wrong changes. It's the options that you kind of develop a repertoire of options that you have. And the more you understand harmony, which is why it's so important to study harmony, then it's not a big deal, right? It's just a matter of knowing, being educated, and then opening your ears. And if everybody can tap into that, some incredible musical moments can start to come out. That being said, another question for you, Nick, this is from Stefan from the community group. He's asking, are there like a certain number of important jazz blues tunes that we should know? Like, do you have any like heads that you would suggest for people to start working on?
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of them. Sandu, Tenor Madness is a great one, and I kind of separate my blues into two categories. So I would think of like a riff-based blues, like a Tenor Madness, or Sunny Moon for Two, another great Sonny Rollins blues. And these are based on like a riff that gets repeated. And that's one of the coolest things about the blues, is that if you come up with a riff that works over the first 4 bars, it will kind of work over the other measures in the blues. Like if you listen to Sunny Moon for Two, it's literally just the same thing 3 times in a row. But it's one of the most swinging blueses that I've ever heard in my life. And then you get a blues like Sandu, which is a little bit more of like what I call a through composed blues. Or if you start listening to Charlie Parker, he wrote what I would consider to be like a bebop blues, right? So I like to separate them in categories, and I have like lists of tunes that, I know, and I will separate the blues tunes into those different categories. So some riff-based blues that I really like, Tenor Madness, Sunny Moon for Two, Blues in the Closet. Have you ever heard that one?
Yeah, totally.
Trying to Blues by Five. That's a really, really great blues that I think everybody should know. Some of the bebop blueses that I really like, so like Au Pravov or Bloom Ditto. Some of the other ones are escaping me a little bit.
Was Blues for Alice, which has those like I guess they call them bird changes, which are, it sort of departs. It's still based on the blues, but that's where you really start adding all these different harmonic movement.
For sure. So when I think about the Blues for Alice is kind of the most complicated one out there. Absolutely. Something to work towards, you know what I mean?
Totally.
But I think with a short list of blues melodies, you could really go out to almost any jam session. It's kind of easy for the rhythm section. They just need to know kind of what key you're in. And then hopefully they have an idea of how the head goes so that they can, support you in the way that they should be. But just learn a handful of them. It's not like you need to know 100 blues heads before you can really put yourself out there. Maybe some of those tunes that we just mentioned. Another great one is Blue Monk. That's one that I hear called all the time at jam sessions. And I think of that one as kind of halfway in between like a riff blues and a through composed blues. So those are some of my favorite blues tunes and some of the first ones that come to mind when I think about tunes that get called at jam sessions.
And here's a little hack for everybody that I just thought of. If you are you're playing at a jam session or a gig and you start to get this overwhelmingly terrifying feeling that someone's going to call a song you don't know, just be like, "Hey guys, we haven't played a blues in a while. Let's play a blues," and then you'll get by one song. So
man, that's a really, really good piece of advice. And then you can say, "Oh man, I gotta go. I gotta get out of here."
oh shoot. Oh gosh, I have to get up early for an appointment tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. There you go. All right. That was just a little bit of humor. Do I have enough humor on this podcast? I don't know. Maybe not. Too serious.
That's an essential part of jazz too, right?
It is. Oh, it so is. If you don't have humor, then it just gets way too serious.
Exactly.
Okay, so here's a couple more questions so we talked a lot about chord changes, we talked a lot about forms, all this really important stuff, that you have to know tunes, you have to be able to listen, the difference between a major and a minor blues, all this really fundamental, pivotal stuff. But there are some people that are wondering, but how do I improvise over this stuff? Which is a huge question, and we cover this a lot on my podcast, and you cover it a lot on your podcast. This is that never-ending journey that you were talking about earlier.
Right.
But let's talk about it a little bit. John asks from the community group, what are some options for soloing over a typical blues progression? Major pentatonic scale, minor pentatonic scale. So he's asking a lot about scales. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Like, if you really are starting from square one, there's some, I like to call scales pitch collections that you can use to draw tones from. And then Mark also asks from the group, how can you avoid getting stuck in just using like the blues scales or arpeggios and stuff like that? So that's a different side of the question. So let's talk about like a basic, are there some scales or some, maybe not scales, but overarching ideas of approaching it for someone who's just starting out?
Yeah, for sure. I'm a huge fan of chord tones. And the reason why I am is just because it's a simple, accessible thing that when we first start playing jazz tunes and improvising, I really truly believe in limiting your options, right? Because there's so many options out there that you can get lost in it, and you'll never actually formulate a concrete idea of a melody. And what you'll end up sounding like is just, you're just noodling on scales, for lack of a better term.
Right.
And I think that that's a huge issue with like education, is that some teachers will just give you, okay, here's the list of scales, go. And you're left wondering, man, I sound like crap. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I have the knowledge in front of me. I have the scales. Why can't I sound like Coltrane? And it's really not your fault. Those are a lot. That's a lot of options for you. And of course you're going to flounder if you have too many options. If I say, hey, let's go grab some food, and I give you a list of 200 restaurants, you're going to be really, really overwhelmed, and it's going to be really tough to make a decision on which restaurant you want to go to. So I feel like this is the way it works when you're improvising as well. So that's why I'm a huge fan of chord tones. So now you narrow yourself down to 4 options over every chord. And the nice thing about chord tones is that they all sound really good. So you're doing 2 things. You're narrowing down your options, and you're narrowing them down to only the best sounding notes over the chord, right?
Absolutely.
And this is a fantastic way to start, because less overwhelming. And if you're thinking less about note choices, maybe you can think a little bit more about rhythm, which is obviously huge. Like, rhythm is way more important than note choice. And if you look back at all the great jazz musicians throughout history, I truly believe that they will all say that it's all about rhythm. So you've got your chord tones, and a lot of people will say to me, like, well, with 4 notes over every chord, my solo is going to be boring. But there's literally nothing that can be less true than a solo just using chord tones being boring. You can play some fantastic solos just using chord tones if you're really good at it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And if you listen to, sorry to interrupt you, Nick.
No,
if you listen to Miles Davis's solo on Freddie Freeloader, is a great example. If he uses very few notes, but it just sounds so great, right?
Yep.
So there you go.
Yeah. And it's really, so I think a lot of people, what happens to them is that they don't go deep enough on the chord tones. And then, your solo is going to be boring because maybe you're starting from the root every single time. Maybe you're ignoring a certain intervallic relationship that's present in the chord tones, but you just haven't practiced them enough to discover that relationship. So, you're just playing up and down the arpeggio every single time. And of course, that's going to be boring. So my true belief and kind of the angle that I approach improvising from is pick a simple concept and go really, really, really deep on it. So take chord tones and figure out how to flip them in every single way possible? Can you go through the blues and start every chord tone sequence on the root? Can you do it on the third? Can you do it on the fifth? Can you do it on the seventh? Can you do it ascending and descending? Can you discover some of those relationships that come from inverting the chord tones and playing them up and down? So, like, for instance, I'm going to play one chorus of the blues just using chord tones, and let's see if I can come up with something that's interesting. Hopefully I can. I'm kind of putting myself on the spot here.
You got this.
So if I play an F blues only using chord tones, let's see what happens. I don't know. It's not the most interesting thing in the world, but I think
sounded killer to me. I mean, that just sounded like a good solo. Just you were doing just that, you know.
Yeah, and I'll do that on stage. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not afraid to. Maybe I make a decision before I start a solo. Like, all right, I'm going to just play with chord tones and let's see what I can do here. So one thing I think that's overlooked on the chord tones a lot, like I was talking about intervallic relationships. So a lot of people would just play 1 3 5 7, and then maybe they'll play 7 5 3 1. But what you're missing out on if you're just doing that is there's actually a whole step relationship between 7 and 1, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're sick of just hearing the relationship of thirds, well, if you invert your chord tone, so maybe now you're playing 3 5 7 1. Now you have the presence of a whole step, which can really open up a lot of possibilities. So things like that, you know, and I think that's why I like to start people with just the chord tones. And I truly believe that's a great way for everybody to start.
Awesome. I love that. I love everything you just said. I mean, I think everybody listening today, I mean, that's all the value you need right there. I mean, you can go and you can put this into practice. You can get there in the shed and just start doing some of the things that Nick just mentioned. So very value packed there. And so just now for those, and to get back to Mark's question from the community group, for those who want to go further than playing the chord tones, what's maybe something that they could do to start taking it a little further for improvising? Yeah,
so I think another beautiful thing about the chord tone approach is that rather than thinking about scales as scales, you can almost think about scales as connecting chord tones.
Oh, right? Yes. Oh, right. That is totally the right philosophy. I love that.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden scales become a lot less overwhelming, right? So if you think about it in terms of so I'll break up my scales. So maybe after I'm done practicing my chord tone stuff, I'll explore the relationship of a scale segment. So maybe 1 2 3, right? And I'll go through the blues and I'll play a bunch of stuff just using 1 2 3 on every chord. So now I'm not thinking about. It's tough to put into words sometimes, the way that you think about things when you're improvising, but I'm thinking about it less as a scale and more as I'm just connecting 1 and 3, right? And then I'll go and do 3 4 5. So now I'm connecting 3 and 5. And then maybe I'll graduate to a larger segment. So maybe now I'm connecting 1 and 5, right? And the 3 just happens to be in the middle there. I think that I was your typical case of middle school jazz band. We're playing something that's not a blues, and the director just hands you a sheet full of scales. And that's what my solo sounded like, was just scales. And I think a real turning point in my playing was when I started to think about scale tones as connecting chord tones. So I'm definitely a huge believer in that. And I'm firsthand example, I guess, that it works. And if you're having trouble with scales, some people don't have trouble with it. Some people just understand it. They understand how the texture works and they sound great right off the bat. I'm definitely not one of those people. So I had to figure out a way to think about it differently.
Yeah. I love that. I think everybody should write that down somewhere. That start with chord tones and then think of scales as connecting that. And you're talking about all those patterns, 1, 2, 5. You could start.
Right.
I mean, there's so many different possibilities.
Right.
And taking that simplistic approach just to start with, and then you can start filling in the gaps. You can start adding chromaticism. Oh man, such great stuff. So Nick, like you obviously know a thing or two about improvising, about the blues, about how to completely just crush the blues. And that is exactly why you have a course called 60 Days to Crushing the Blues. And I just feel like there are more people that want to go further with you. So could you tell us a bit about this course?
Yeah, so it's a video course. So it comes with basically a whole bunch of videos that go along with every single week of me demonstrating some of the material and just trying to explain it in a way which I feel like I couldn't write down. So when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to present this course, I thought of just writing like an ebook or something like that. And then I figured, well, we have this ability to do video nowadays. So why don't I do a video course with like PDFs that accompany it? Because one of my favorite things about teaching is like, being in the same room as a person and kind of having a conversation. And just for me personally, I feel like I can get my ideas across a lot better when I'm just speaking. So there's videos, jam-packed with videos. There's a ton of PDFs, one that goes along with each week. And I tried to set it up almost like I would if you were a student of mine. So basically, I'm just giving you assignments every week. And the first week is like, the most basic form of the blues, some exercises that we can do over it to start familiarizing ourselves with it. And then it progressively works its way into more of like a bebop blues. So I forget which week it is, but I'll present the 6th chord to you in measure 8. And we'll spend a week just talking about, all right, what is this 6th chord? Why does it sound good? How do we use it? Why is it even there? Some of the theory behind the secondary dominant stuff and those kind of things. And then I'll give you a bunch of material to work on to hopefully start to assimilate some of that more advanced stuff into your playing. And I've gotten a lot of good feedback from it because, like I said, the blues can really open you up to a lot of the other mysterious jazz forms that after you spend, let's say, 60 days with the blues and just the blues, now you look at a tune that previously had been like, looks like hieroglyphics to you. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, well, now I recognize that progression. That's just blah, 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 this thing that we covered in the blues. Or you start to recognize the relationships between chords. Oh, that just goes up to the 4 chord, just like the blues does. Or, right. Oh, hey, that's a 2-5-1 or a turnaround or whatever. So I think that the 60 days that you could really dedicate to this course is not just time that you're dedicating towards the blues. It's really going to show up in a lot of different situations. And I'm just really excited. And obviously you can tell I'm passionate about just, this is the place to start. So if you're looking for a good starting place, I think the course would be a good way to go. And I like the fact that it's self-guided. So yeah, it's called 60 Days to Crushing the Blues, but like if you need 180 days to get through all the material because you don't have a ton of time, that's the real beauty of it. Awesome. You can go at your own pace. You can spend, let's say you get to week 4 and you're like, oh, okay, this is harder than I thought. Great, spend a month on it. And that's totally fine. You do not need to get through it in 60 days.
Right. That's awesome. So that sounds like a great course. So for those who want to check that out, where can they find that?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, and it's the number 10minutejazzlesson.com, and click on the store tab, you can find that and a couple of other courses that we have, and all the stuff that's going on at the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson too, which I think a lot of you will find very useful. We put out a PDF with every single episode. So I've talked to a lot of listeners that over the years have filled like binders with these PDFs, and
oh, that's so cool.
They say, well, I can't get to everything every week, but then you have everything, which has been one of the best pieces of feedback I've gotten from everything that's going on over at that website.
So cool. Well, Nick, I want to thank you so much for just absolutely laying down a ton of value for my audience today. Really appreciate it. And I think we might have you back again sometime in the future.
Awesome, man. I would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that's all for today's show. I want to thank you so much for listening, and another special thanks to our guest, Nick Mainella, for just laying it down. Make sure you check out the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast and, of course, his course. And listen, hey, I've enjoyed having you today. Thanks for sticking in through the end. It's a long interview, but a value-packed one, and so I really appreciate you for listening. I do what I do because of you, so thank you. And if you did get some value out of today's show, I always ask to leave a rating and a review on iTunes. Give some positive feedback. Helps other people find the show and know that it's a show worth listening to. And it's just a free way, simple way, fast way to give back. So thank you so much for taking that time. All right, next week, we are going to be having episode 111. I'm looking forward to seeing you back then.
Thanks for listening to the LJS podcast, brought to you by LearnJazzStandards.com. Subscribe to the series on iTunes, and don't forget to join our jazz community at LearnJazzStandards.com/newsletter.